So hi to everyone who's just joined. Welcome to NPC's seminar on developing a learning culture. For those of you, my name is Charlotte Lamb. I am Strategy Principal at NPC. I've been at NPC for coming up to 4 years, so I've worked with lots of charities, and I know that developing a learning culture can be one of the most difficult things to do, but one of the most rewarding things as well. I'm delighted to have 2 other speakers here with me today. So we have Dave Salisbury from SK Consulting, who's going to share with us his experience of building a learning culture at various organisations, including Macmillan Cancer Support, and Louise Russell, who's Head of Strategy and Planning at Diabetes UK, who's going to share her experience on embarking on this journey at Diabetes UK. So thank you for the 2 of you for being with us today, and you'll hear much more from them shortly. So just a very brief explanation for those of you who don't know NPC, you might be new to these sorts of events. We're a think tank and a consultancy for the charity sector. We're a charity ourselves, and our mission is to make the charity sector more effective. And we do this in a number of ways. We work directly with charities and funders on a range of initiatives to make them more impactful, such as strategy development or impact measurement. We also conduct research on particular issues that are relevant to the sector. We raise awareness, share best practice, and run training and events like these in order to convene others and to build capacity in the sector. So I know we're all much more used to Zoom than we ever were before, but just in case, just a quick bit of housekeeping before we kick off. So we'll be hoping to hear from everyone today, but while you're not speaking, please do keep yourself on mute so the sound remains nice and clear for everyone else. Please use the chat function as much as you like. Some of you have already started doing that by introducing yourselves, and feel free to make comments or add questions into the chat. You can share with the whole group, or you can chat directly to people. So if you want to ask a question specifically to me and it be anonymous, you can send that to me and I can share it with everyone. During the Q&A session and the discussion, please feel free to raise a virtual hand. So you can do that through looking at, on the participant's name, you've got the option to raise a hand next to your name. Or if you want to, you can go old school and raise an actual hand, but just bear in mind that I can't see everyone on the screen at once, so it might take me a few moments to kind of catch you if you do that. So please feel free to use both. And if you are experiencing a problem with bandwidth, just try turning off your video for a moment. It often helps. Great, so now that's out of the way, let's get going. So in today's webinar, we're going to share some of NPC's advice on developing a learning culture. So I'm going to be talking through that at the beginning. We're then going to hear from Louise and Dave, who are going to share their own experience. There will then be a chance for Q&A and discussion after the presentations. And then later on, we're going to be going into virtual breakout rooms to do an exercise together with a smaller group. And you'll have a chance to discuss your experiences with the other attendees in that session. And we are planning to close today at 3:30. Okay, all right. So now all of those, the agenda's out the way, I will kick off with some of NPC's thinking on developing a learning culture. So I suppose over the last 3 months, charities have been responding to the COVID crisis, and many charities have had to rapidly adapt what they do, whether that's meeting a completely different need or completely changing the way that they deliver their services. And there have been some really amazing things happening. And this has also been a really brilliant time for learning. So we've all had to try different things and test other methods. It's made us have to be a lot more curious about what works, where, why, and for who. And I think we've all learned so much about what works and what doesn't, things that we would never have known before. And so now we might be thinking, as things start to return to normal, or whatever normal may be, how can we use what we've learned? How can we make sure we don't lose it? But also, how can we continue this trend of learning what works and what doesn't, and make sure we have the biggest impact possible? So I guess first I'll thinking about, what do we actually mean by learning? So I guess learning is, it's the acquisition of knowledge and skills through study, experience, or being taught. But actually, I think when it comes to a learning culture, being willing to change based on what you've learned is actually even more important. And it's particularly relevant as an organisation grows, or perhaps is trying something different, or, which is the case most of us find ourselves in at the moment, the environment is changing at a really fast rate. So you have to kind of adapt what you do. I guess I'd be interested to know from you all here, what stops your organisations from learning? And if you want to just shout out a few things or post something in the chat, feel free to answer it that way. Time and capacity from Diana. Yeah, too busy delivering. Yeah, I know what that feels like. They're very common things that I hear as well. Joe says change exhaustion. Yeah, I recognise that. Staff changes, not taking the time to reflect. Siloed working is an interesting one, and stuck in a rut. Yes, I know. I recognise that too. So lots and lots of different reasons, probably things that you all recognise. And actually, I wanted to share this with you today, which is a kind of a cartoon on why organisations don't learn. So it points out a few of the things that some of you guys have said, but I guess there's 4 sort of big things that often come up. So the first is this sort of bias towards success, which can lead to a few challenges. So there's a fear of failure there. So actually there's, you don't want to try something new. You don't want to take any risks because what if it fails? And actually we need to being successful feels more important than that. Secondly, this bias towards action, which is kind of that feeling of thinking we just need to get stuff done. And that leaves us exhausted with no time or energy left for reflection on what we've learned. So I know a couple of you mentioned that. The third kind of very common reason is a bias towards fitting in. So this belief that we need to conform and do what others are doing. And actually, this can be bad for a number of reasons. One, because what others are doing isn't necessarily always the right thing, but also because it doesn't allow us to play to our individual strengths and find out actually where can we have the biggest impact based on our resources and the environment we're in, rather than just kind of copying what others do or what you've always done. And then finally, this bias towards kind of following the expert, and sort of with quite a narrow view of expertise, which kind of means that you might often forget actually that frontline staff in your organisations know so much about what works and what doesn't, and actually forgetting to learn from them is quite a common mistake that organisations make. So lots and lots of reasons on top of the ones that some of you have said. So I feel hopefully you don't feel alone in this challenge. It is difficult. Organisations do find it hard to learn, but it's crucial that we try and overcome some of these barriers. And I think there are kind of 3 main ways that learning can help organisations. So firstly, I think we make better decisions by learning, and so kind of your charitable interventions are likely to be more effective, and we can be better equipped to deal with changes and the complexity of kind of the environment that we're facing. Actually, if we have a really good understanding of what works and what doesn't, we're better equipped to cope with that change when it comes about. Secondly, I think sometimes it feels counterintuitive to say this, but we can save money and time. So I think by making up that little investment in front in learning, I think we improve our day-to-day practice. We can make ourselves more efficient and understand actually how do we maximize the use of our resources, what is needed when. And so in the long run, this should lead to kind of better services, but also saved time as well. And then finally, I think a really important point about what a learning culture can do is it can help you communicate better. So I think by having a better understanding of what's working and where your organisation is having an impact, you can be more open about what you do. So that could be to supporters of your work, to funders, to staff within your organisation, but also to beneficiaries as well. And I think by kind of talking about that much more, it also makes us accountable, but also more credible if we're doing that. So there's lots of sort of different reasons why you'd want to develop a learning culture, I think. But I think currently in the sector, generally what we're seeing is a learning culture is generally unrealized, and often actually good practices and systems for using evidence effectively aren't really there. So NPC uses what we like to call an evidence journey, and I'm going to talk you through sort of perhaps what a flawed evidence journey might look like. So this might be something that you've seen before in other organisations or your organisation, but I'll sort of talk you through that. So this follows NPC's cycle of impact cycle, which is plan, do, assess, and review. So how you'd actually go. So through planning, you're planning exactly what you're going to measure. Do is you're actually collecting what you're going to measure. Assess is you review what you've measured and what it means for your organisation. And then review might be, well, what does that mean? How are you going to change your actions based on that information? And so a sort of a flawed evidence journey, and one we see quite commonly, looks like this. So at the plan stage, you might have decisions that are based on sort of hunches or patchy evidence, or maybe we're doing this because we've already done it, and it's all good intentions, but it's sort of quite a not particularly strong evidence base to do that actual service design. And then when it comes to thinking through your evidence design, so how are you going to design how we collect evidence of what's working, charities often feel they want to prove their impact for funding reasons. And often that doesn't lead to the best sort of evaluation framework on which to assess your learning. Then when it gets to the do stage, I think staff and volunteers and service users can feel very fed up with filling in forms. As a result, there's sort of a poor response rates become the norm. And then at the assess phase, actually, there's sort of a little or no use made by data, made of the data by staff. So even if quite a lot of effort's gone into collecting it, it just sits in a folder somewhere and actually doesn't really get used. And that leads to kind of at the review phase, there's not really much learning from failures or things that haven't worked. And actually there's little communication of it as well. So perhaps evaluation reports aren't published or not read or used if they are. And I think that sort of then feeds into a cycle of people kind of thinking actually, they don't use that in their role, and there's not much learning, and nothing really changes as you go through the next cycle of that. So hopefully, I think some of these will feel familiar to all people. At some point in their career, they'll have worked somewhere where at least part of this journey feels familiar. And so what does a good evidence journey look like? So what's the kind of thing that we should really be aiming for? Well, following the same structure, plan, do, assess and review, a really good evidence journey looks like right at that plan stage when you're planning your services. Decisions are based on the best evidence available, combined with views of staff and service users. So that's really important to emphasize that combination. And actually the evidence design, so how are you going to evaluate this service, is the activities based on what evidence already exists, and it's deeply in the context of the service. So what's going to work in terms of evidence collection for this particular service. So it's really, really, really tailored and thought through. And then at the do phase, when you're actually collecting the evidence, the data collection and analysis is relevant. There's strong feedback loops for staff and volunteers to feed into. And then when it comes to actually assessing this, the staff or volunteers have the skills to work with that data. So you've got people with the right skills kind of analysing it and looking at it. And they have access to it to be able to use it in their work and improve it as well. So it doesn't just sit in one person's inbox or one person's file folder, but actually the people who need it have access to it and have the skills to analyse it. And this, can lead to a really high proportion of evaluation reports being published, much better communication about it, much more honesty about failures and learning points, and actually they become sort of central. So it's not just what's gone well, what did we achieve, but what didn't work and, what could we have done better next time? And actually feeding that into the beginning of the planning loop again. So taking that background into service design next time, how are you going to do it? And actually this can lead to sort of funders, sector bodies and academics bringing together and sharing evidence. So if all organisations got really good at doing this, we'd have such an amazing body of evidence in order to share and, you know, become much more knowledgeable for each organisation. And ultimately, all organisations will work together around evidence much more by doing that. So that's sort of a picture of what an ideal evidence journey looks like and what we might all be working towards. But I think, but there are sort of steps towards making an evidence journey more, you know, to actually getting towards that evidence journey. So the first really is making better use of existing evidence. So, you know, one of the things at NPC we always say is that, you know, you shouldn't be trying to create kind of evidence that, you know, you don't need to. So use what's already out there. It takes a lot of time to create good evidence, and sometimes the right evidence already exists for you to be out there and using. So kind of having a think about what's already out there that you can use. Secondly, having a proportionate approach to new data collection. So again, if it's not out there, maybe you need to create it, but what's proportionate? So what is a reasonable amount of time and effort to take in order to kind of collect that data? And thirdly, making better use of your data to manage your impact. So brilliant if you collect it, brilliant if you're making use of existing evidence, but it's only useful to you if you're actually using it afterwards. So how do you do that? And then the fourth thing that we talk about is developing and embedding a learning culture, which is what the focus of today's webinar is on. And this is often, you know, with organisations that I've worked with, this is often the really tricky stage. So, you know, 1, 2 and 3, not to say they're easy, but there are kind of steps you can follow, and lots of organisations are on that journey. Whereas developing and embedding a learning culture is something that takes a lot more time. It is a bit more tricky to do. Yeah, it can be really, organisations can really struggle, but it's probably the thing that makes the biggest difference, I would say. So what do we mean by developing and embedding a learning culture? So there's kind of, it's a learning culture is involving everyone in delivering your service, and they will have various knowledge and skills, attitudes and beliefs and behaviours that will contribute to a learning culture. So the kinds of knowledge and skills that you'd see from all staff in a learning culture might be that they understand your mission and your plan to achieve it. They understand how measurement contributes to your objectives and what your learning priorities are. So what are the things you really want to be learning from that measurement and evaluation? Staff might understand their own role in measurement and evaluation, you know, not just think, oh, that's the M&E team, but actually everyone has a role to play in it. And I think all staff understanding their role is really vital. And they have the right analysis and interpretation skills for their role. So everyone would have slightly different skills required in that area, but they know they have the right skills to do it. On attitudes and beliefs, I think the thing that's really key is that belief in the potential to improve services through learning. So, you know, lots of people might have had quite negative experiences of evidence before, maybe where it wasn't done well, it took lots of time and it didn't make any difference. And actually, I think we really need to try and embed that attitude and make people believe that, you know, there is real potential to improve the impact of what they do through learning. The other types of attitudes are being willing to change, which I think is quite tough, but being committed to the mission of the organisation over the way of getting there, so over the established way of doing things. And I think that's the really key thing to stress about being willing to change, because you kind of need the why. So emphasising that mission rather than the activities that you're doing will enable more flexibility and kind of commitment to getting there in whichever way works best. I think being curious about what service is achieving and whether it can be improved is so important. And, you know, going into organisations, that's often one of the first things I notice. If staff are curious about what they can learn and whether what they're doing is having an impact, you often have a much stronger learning culture. And I think that goes hand in hand with that feeling excited about the possibility for improvement. So thinking, how could we always make this better? I think is really, really key. I think the final two are also worth talking about: the accepting failure without blame. So I think often we're so scared of failure, we don't want to talk about it. And actually being able to talk about failure and what didn't work in a kind of comfortable way, an open way, a way that feels you're not going to get blamed for it, it's going to be seen as a bad thing, can really, really contribute to a much more open culture that talks about failure and learns from it and uses that to make the service better. And then finally, these sorts of kind of knowledge and skills and attitudes kind of lead to behaviours that look like a learning approach in everything that organisations do. So always asking, how can things be improved? How can we make this better? That can lead you to collecting good quality data, to regularly discussing the results with others and learning from others. And changing what you do as a result of that learning, which I think is the really tough bit. But actually, if you start to develop these knowledge and attitudes, these behaviours start to come about kind of naturally. So I'm going to talk you through today 12 steps to developing an organisational learning culture. And don't worry, I'll share the slides afterwards, so don't feel like you have to be furiously noting all of these down. I understand 12 is quite a lot, but I'll talk through them now. So the first is develop a knowledge and learning plan. So it sounds obvious, but having a clear plan together that summarises your learning intentions and the data that you want to collect to support your learning will really help you. So the plan should cover things like, what are your knowledge and learning priorities? What methodology will you use to collect the data? Who's responsible for collecting the data? What are the key timings and milestones for when things will happen? How will learnings be communicated and shared? And that's not just externally to the organisation, but within the team. So who needs to know between each other? Who'll be responsible for implementing improvements? And how often are you going to update this plan? So just making a plan can be really, really helpful. And actually a useful tool that organisations have used is Inspiring Impact's Measuring Up tool. So it's a free step-by-step self-assessment tool that allows you to review and improve your organisation's impact practice. So it asks you to look at the way you plan, evidence and communicate the learning that you have about the difference that you make. So we'll be sharing that after the seminar for anyone who wants to use that tool. It's really, really helpful. So the second is communication. So start by sharing your commitment to knowledge and learning and the approach that you plan to take. So everyone working on a project should be familiar with the knowledge and learning plan that you've made. And you also might want to share it with service users or other stakeholders as well. I think part of that commitment to doing it as well kind of nudges people on. And I think this communication is more tangible if you talk about specific learning questions. So you should have agreed those in the learning plan, but thinking about what are the questions that you want to answer by collecting the data that you're collecting. So the third area is about defining roles and responsibilities. So everyone should be aware of their role in sort of this creation and knowledge creation and learning. And we talked about it earlier. I think one of the kind of knowledge and attitudes of actually everyone has got a role to play in assessing and evaluation and measurement kind of really helps. So senior staff set the tone and promote knowledge and learning as an essential part of delivery and organisational practice. So it's up there as much as finance, risk and service delivery. Actually learning and measurement should be sort of promoted as something that's really important. I think managers play a really crucial role in building a knowledge and learning culture. So, you know, they're often the interface between senior staff and frontline, and they should sort of be talking to their staff all the time about the benefits of undertaking these knowledge and learning activities as well. And also I think they've got a big role to play in understanding the results. So when you're collecting data, what does that mean and what does that mean you can do to improve? And actually frontline staff and volunteers who are delivering activities are often responsible for collecting data. So they have a huge role to play. And they're often in the best position to offer useful feedback and insights around what's happening. And actually service users themselves should also feel free to share their views and have opportunities for greater involvement if they choose. I think that's a really interesting opportunity for organisations to learn more as well. The fourth area is capacity. So as some of you mentioned earlier, it can be difficult to fit this, fit learning and evaluation in, but actually giving people time to engage and participate in evaluation and learning means that, they won't, they'll prioritise it. And it also gives the message that this is really important. If staff are having to fit it in alongside all their other stuff, I think it gives that impression that it's not as important. Fifth, we have leadership. So someone should take overall responsibility for knowledge and learning. I think one way to promote knowledge and learning is to get people to act as champions. So this can help bridge gaps between different people in the organisation. So you might have different leaders of evaluation and learning in different teams, and champions can often help kind of bridge that gap and make sure there aren't silos in how you're capturing learning. Number 6 is involve people. So try to get staff, volunteers and beneficiaries involved in the design of knowledge and learning processes. So how are you going to collect this stuff, this information and this data? And actually talking to service users would be a great way of figuring that out, because actually they're ultimately the ones who are going to be sharing that data with you. And I think removing kind of jargon around evidence and learning can really help that as well. So make the language really accessible as possible. 7 is incentives. So thinking about what further incentives you can offer to promote knowledge and learning. So putting it in job descriptions or making it part of people's objectives is also a really helpful way of doing that. So kind of emphasizing the importance of this as everybody's role and as part of everybody's role can really incentivize staff to doing that. But I think the more important thing is actually trying to get people to see the difference that learning is making. So when people are capturing learning, using it, actually you should see more of an impact. And I think that's probably the biggest incentive of all, and actually really motivates people to continue to do it when they can see the impact of that. 8 is make data collection and use as easy as possible. So that sounds kind of obvious, but thinking about what systems and processes staff are going to have to use, and constantly thinking about how can we make this quicker and how can we make this easier. Is there a way that we can change this really long form written report into something that staff can do on the computer alongside another process? Or thinking about that, I think, is really helpful. And also talking to your service users about how they want to share data and how it can be as quick and easy for them to kind of fill that in as well. 9 is having the right systems and processes for learning. So again, you want to make it quick and easy, but also you want it to kind of think about how can learning feed into your current systems and processes. So a common approach is to cover learning in team meetings or occasional conferences. But actually, if there are processes for sharing and disseminating between teams that could be more regular and feed into regular structured processes, that's a really helpful thing. I worked with an organisation once who, at the beginning of their weekly meeting, they all had to say something that went wrong last week and what they learned from it. And it was quite an unusual way to start a meeting, because normally people start with what went right last week, or what did we achieve? But actually, by starting with this went wrong, it changed the culture around failure. So it allowed everybody had to say something that went wrong, and saying what did I learn from it kind of introduced that element of it's okay for things to go wrong, and as long as we learn from them. And so it sort of set that precedent, and it was fed into an existing meeting already. So it didn't sort of add too much of a burden. So small things like that around systems and processes, I think, are really, really good opportunities. 10 is learning from mistakes and failure, which is sort of what I just said around promoting a mindset that focuses on improvement. So, okay, often we're going to get disappointing results or things aren't going to work. Rather than not talk about those or sweep them under the rug, actually they should be acknowledged and examined, and staff should be encouraged to do this and to share this. Apparently some organisations even throw failure parties where people get together and share what hasn't worked, which may or may not appeal to you. But, you know, just another example of encouraging sharing those things as well. And acknowledging your capabilities is really important. So looking at the skills and resources you have internally to do that evaluation and research. And actually, it might be that you need to do some upskilling, or perhaps you need to you know, look for some external support into doing that. So making sure that you have exactly the right support in there. And then finally, number 12 is give it time. So as you'll all know, culture isn't something you can change overnight. You need to allow it to take shape, and actually it's small things kind of you know, feeding on top of each other that are going to actually make significant changes. So it's always worth looking for quick wins so that people can see the value of knowledge and learning, and you can kind of introduce some of these things quickly. But actually it might take a few years before you have, you know, a really strong learning and evaluation culture and all the right systems are in place. So I've got up on the slide here a bunch of resources that would be helpful. So I'm going to share those after the webinar, so you'll be able to access all of those as well. And I think I'll also add the measuring up tool from Inspiring Impact, the one I mentioned right early on, which is free to use. Okay, so I think I'm going to pause there, and I'm just going to ask if people might have questions for discussion. I'm going to have all the questions and answer session after the presentations, just to kind of keep it concise. So please keep note of those questions. You will have a chance to ask them shortly. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Louise, who's going to share her experience of starting to implement a learning culture at Diabetes UK. Thank you, Louise.
Hello, thank you, Charlotte. Thank you for inviting me. So yes, I'm the head of strategy and planning at Diabetes UK, and I would say we're probably at an early stage of our journey about developing a learning culture. There are probably definitely things that we still want to do, but it's actually been helpful for me putting this together, just to sort of reflect on the things that we have done and what's made a difference. And I think key to us was that we started certainly this phase of this journey with the development of a new organisational strategy. And I think it's been really useful to us that we sort of started at that beginning point about what we're trying to achieve as an organisation. And through that, one of the sort of cross-cutting strands that now sits through all our strategy is a learning and improving together element, which is one of the things that we've wanted to use the strategy to drive. And it's probably worth reflecting on how we approached the strategy, because I think that in the first instance was when we went into the process of thinking we don't want our strategy to be something, A, there's a set of plans which are out of date as quickly as we've written them, or B, a marketing document that looks good and flashy but doesn't necessarily help us as an organisation. We wanted it to be something which would help us have that clarity about what we're trying to achieve. So Charlotte referred to being really clear about what you're trying to achieve, and then willing to sort of question and learn about the best way of getting there. So we started the development of our strategy over a year, I think, before we actually launched it. And I think, again, people have said the issue about making time for this, and I think it was really important to us that we did take time to do this. We did a number of things around talking to staff and stakeholders, looking at evidence that probably are more standard things to develop a new strategy. We also had an exercise which we called forward thinking, which is when we went and talked to nearly 100 different people, some close to diabetes as a sector, some in very different sectors, to try and understand from them what they thought some of the key trends and things happening in the external world would be over the next 15 years. We were looking really quite a long way ahead, and we developed a number of scenarios which were not our attempt to predict the future in any way, but they were our attempt to think about all the things that could possibly change over that 15 years, so that we didn't have a strategy that was rooted in a particular way of seeing things or a particular mindset, but was open to the possibilities and the opportunities there. So I think that really helped us. And we also found that that was a useful learning exercise for us in itself. So doing that scenario thinking, and we are now reapplying that approach as we think about how we need to change and adapt to a world beyond COVID, and thinking about what might be the scenarios for the world sort of in 2 or 3 years that we need to now be planning for. The second key thing that I think has been really important to us on this journey is beginning to think about planning in a slightly different way. So when I started with the organisation a couple of years ago, planning was this big annual monolithic process which everyone went through and almost universally hated, I would say. But what we've tried to do is to move this into something where we recognise that actually it's something we need to do much more regularly, much more light touch, in a way that actually means that we are thinking about what we want to achieve and thinking about what have we learned that helps us understand what the best way of achieving that is at this time. So we've instituted a new, what we've called an outcome-focused approach to planning, and some of the key things that we've done within that is we've set up around each of the headline outcomes that we're trying to achieve within our strategy. We've set up a cross-organisational steering group of people at different levels in the organisation who bring in some new thinking, look at what we're learning and is happening, and then review what are the plans that we want to take to achieve this outcome approach. And just to give you an indication of how we've tried to make this much more light touch and responsive, since we set our plans for 2020 at the end of last year, we've reviewed them twice, which this is probably quite an unusual year, but the process we put in place enabled us to do that. It enabled us to have the people who were, and it enabled us to have the mindset to recognise that we had to do it. And I would say, I think we were talking earlier about sometimes some of the difficulties of getting rid of the established way of doing things, that being in the sort of situation we are now, where there is this element of fluidity, I think has really helped us to enable us to think differently about some of these things. And we also sort of, so through that, we applied a model and we worked with NPC around this, which was based on their evidence journey approach, and based on a theory of change, or we called it a logic model approach, to try and identify what we called our best way plans. So these are the outcomes we want to achieve. What do we think is the best way we can achieve these, but also recognising that it's only the best way for now, and we need to keep on learning and coming back to that. And then the third thing that I would just focus on is the work we've done more specifically around in a more standard approach to measuring and understanding our impact. And there's been, again, we've used our best way plans as the starting point for that, and we've developed evidence journeys around those that help us to understand what is it we need to learn, and therefore what is the measurement framework we should be putting around that in order to help us to learn. I think what I would say around that is that the points about how you engage people widely in the organisation about thinking about that have been really key for us, and I think that's definitely one of the challenges, that measurement is seen as the sort of the more technical, specific element of the sort of strategy and planning world, which other people feel less able to get involved in. So how we give people the sort of confidence as much as anything really to recognise that it's nothing particularly rocket science about what we're trying to achieve. And I think the NPC model has helped us with that, and we've got a way to go. And then some sort of high level things that we've done at the top of the organisation to help that. So I saw in the chat someone talking about how you bring the sort of measurement and evaluation for accountability together with for learning, and we have tried to do that through our approach to measurement framework. And we used to have a quarterly meeting, which was our sort of senior leadership getting together and looking at performance reports, and we've now repurposed that as a quarterly learning review, where we do look at some of that more standard performance data, but we also look at some of the impact measures as well. And we explicitly, just changing the name and changing some of the things that are on the agenda, have made it part of that to actually focus in on learning. And I think we've only had a couple of those this year, but again, I do think that the nature of those has changed and helped to make a difference. And then just quickly, Charlotte suggested I talked a little bit about some of the challenges. I think certainly some of the ones that people have flagged up have been really key. I think there's been the issue around how we get over this mindset that people have about how can we really measure the impact of what we're doing as opposed to what everyone else is doing, and the attribution contribution debate. And we've tried to move people away from that and say this is about us understanding the impact of the specific activities that we have identified are part of our best way plan, so that we can review, is this still the best way? There's definitely a challenge around data and getting hold of the right data, and some of that is technical, and we're doing work to improve our data systems. But some of it also is really about us just getting better at seeing data as a key element of this process, and embedding a sort of comfortableness with working with data a bit more amongst people. And the third element for us has been identifying the need for us to be much more systematic about how we use insights from people with diabetes and from people using our services. So we did a lot of that. It was very sort of close to people, that they wanted to do a lot of hearing what people say. We didn't do it in a very systematic way or a very structured way, which meant we could apply it and share it across the organisation. So that's probably so beginning to make some steps on that. And again, I think we've identified it. And we've identified that we want to do more about bringing it together. And then finally, and I think I'd come back to the point about sort of getting away from the established way, getting away from the silos. So our outcome focus has been really important for that, but it is still something that we find really difficult. We're not a huge organisation, but we're a relatively large organisation, and therefore sort of moving quickly and adapting is not necessarily that easy. And I think also, I noticed there is one of the people we've recently entered into a big funding agreement here from Sport England is in the room, but we do find that where we have restricted funding and the sort of how we manage in terms of our approach to what we're trying to do and the expectations of funders is being something I think, again, we probably need to become more confident about the approach we're taking and having those conversations with funders as well. Yeah, so that's it in a nutshell. But as I say, we are on the early stages, and some of these things are relatively new. So seeing how they work out is going to be a big part of our learning as we go forward.
Great, thank you, Louise. That was so helpful to hear, and really interesting that actually some of the sort of small things that you mentioned, like just reframing that quarterly meeting you have as a learning meeting, can actually, go quite far to kind of framing mindsets and attitudes towards it. And actually, even though the agenda's only changed slightly, there's a much greater focus on learning. So I think that's really, really interesting to hear about. And yeah, good luck with the rest of it. It sounds like you've made a great start on the journey. That sounds really good. So thank you. And so now I'm going to hand over to Dave. Dave, who's going to talk you through a variety of his experiences and what he's learned on this subject, after which there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. And I'll just say to those of you who've posted in the chat, I've captured those, so we will pick those up after Dave's presentation as well. Thank you. Dave, over to you.
Hi. So I think there we go. I've got a couple of slides to talk to. So I'm Dave Salisbury. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm also a trustee of the Charities Evaluation Working Group. And I think one of the reasons I was asked to talk today is because I've been doing some blogging for CHU around building a culture of evidence. Before all of that, I was working for Macmillan, where I spent 7 years working for Macmillan. I had a brief sabbatical in Canada, lived and worked over there for a bit. And over the years, I've sort of shared ideas and listened to folks from sort of across the sector and sort of done my bit to try to build a culture of using evidence. So I'm going to share some of my reflections based on that time and my experience with clients and colleagues across the sector. And in 10 minutes, I'm going to try and go from the broad concept of culture to some practical steps and some of the things that I've tried. I'm an evidence person, so my background is in evaluation, and so I'm talking about building a culture of evidence, but it fits. And if we move to the next slide, sorry. And I think when I've been reflecting on building a culture and what it takes to build a culture, I've also thought about the sort of stages that you kind of go through, and it's always a bit imperfect, as the cycle might suggest, as the E on translate might suggest. It was not deliberate, but it's there. And I think there are various sort of stages, or even sort of buckets, that you kind of find yourself in as you go through this task of trying to develop a culture of learning or of evidence, where actually you sort of you're doing a bit of definition, you're then translating what that might mean to your organization, and then you're sort of really trying to specify, well, what can we actually do, and prioritize what you can actually do, and then reflect on that, and then you kind of go back around the cycle again. So I don't think it's something that ever sort of there's a big start and stop to. If we go to the next slide. So I'm going to kind of use those as sort of headings to talk to. And the first bit is around defining. And I think to influence or create a culture, it's helpful to define what a culture is made up of. So my experience was working in a bigger charity, and a lot of the colleagues that I've spoke to in similar circumstances. And within that organisation, there's usually sort of a dominant culture. There's usually already a culture, and it's probably deeply rooted to its mission. And I think that's often right. And so usually what I've been talking with colleagues about, or what I've been involved in, is sort of developing sort of a subculture within that dominant culture. So if the dominant culture is, say, a culture that really centers around compassion, and compassion is super important to that culture, it might be totally right for that organization to have that as the dominant culture. But the sort of subculture of evidence can support that, especially for a larger organization. If you're using evidence well, then you can support the organization to be more compassionate, more empathetic to the people that it's working with. And there's these different things that can help you to think about your organization's culture, these different sort of domains of culture that can help you to think about your organization's culture. Symbols might be job titles, logos, apparel, or they might also be the sort of symbolic cake-fueled gatherings that you sort of stand around and say well done for, or so on. Language, I think, is really important. When we talk about the use of evidence, are we all using the same language around what makes good evidence or what doesn't? Values, there's lots of talk in the sector around values, but of course they're the principles that guide our behaviour. Norms, these are the things that sort of set our standards and expectations for how we expect things to go in the organisation, the kinds of behaviours that we expect to see. And then artefacts is a bit of a funny word, but that's kind of the tangible stuff, the products, and that might be some physical products or reports or that kind of thing, but it also might be the processes and procedures that kind of bring the culture to life, the things that you follow. If we go to the next one. So the task then is to take these big domains that on the previous slide, where you think, oh gosh, that's massive. How do I break that up into something that I can actually do something about in my organization, and translate them into something that you can do? And for me, this was throughout my career, this has been sort of a very long accidental road that seemingly has no end. And I don't think it needs to be that way. I think there's things that can accelerate your journey along this sort of road. One of the things that we did fairly early on when at Macmillan was a sort of theory of change for our own work. We're always asking other people to do theories of change for their programs, their projects. We practiced what we preached. We did our theory of change. And then, of course, within organizations, heads of change, directors change. As you're trying to develop culture, people move around, and people that have different preferences. Some people might really like theory of change. Some people might not. It might not resonate with them as much. And so we ended up with these kind of these having to refine and re-explain and sort of refocus and re-show our ideas. And so we ended up with these kind of key areas that we wanted to address, that kind of evolved from our theory of change. And we use those areas alongside a framework I'll show you a little bit later to get to something that was sort of a maturity model that helped us to reflect on where we were and where we were planning to get to. And that helped us with a bit of planning as well. But those areas were still quite broad. So for example, staff capabilities, if we flip on to the next slide. So staff capabilities, to me, is still quite a large area. So even after the translation, the task can feel quite overwhelming. So to sort of break it up and chunk it up into things that you can actually make a difference on, it helped to sort of break those areas out a little bit, and then prioritize them. So one thing that I've prioritized in my work is around getting that common language, because I think it's just so important. But staff capabilities could involve that common language. It could involve training around, we were doing pop-up bits of training here and there around theory of change or evaluation, but nothing programmatic. What if we had a program of evidence skills training? Influencing corporate induction, so you're influencing people's norms as they come into the organization. They expect people to behave in a more evidence-based way, or maybe you're changing some of the artifacts, the processes or procedures that can actually help to make evidence more accessible. And if we do a couple of clicks, that last bit was just to show that these activities often overlap with different areas of activity that I described, these different bits. So they, it might be about access, and it might also be about senior influencing. It might be about staff capability. So that's the way that we kind of saw it. If we go on to the next bit. But after breaking it down to that level, it can be, something's gone a bit funny with the forward, but it can be a bit, you need a way of checking back. Oh, actually, are we dealing with the sort of problems that we identified in the first place, or the issues that we identified in the first place? So we going to have the impact on the culture that we were trying to have. And so this is just an example of how you might map those activity areas back onto that culture area as almost like a check. If you're using a formula, there's another thing to check that formula is working. This is my version of that with culture. And the next one. And that kind of brings us to this reflecting point. And this is sort of a bit of a Frankenstein of a maturity model. It's an amalgamation of lots of different maturity models about being learning organizations, about being evidence-based organizations. And it was something that when I was at Macmillan, we used to just think about where we were and where we wanted to get to, and what steps we might need to take to get there, or what activity areas we might want to prioritize to get there. So we sort of aligned our activity areas and went one by one and said, well, when it comes to staff capabilities, are we chaotic? Are there pockets of people being able to use those skills, or are we pervasive? Does everybody have the skills that they need to use evidence really well? And we were able to reflect on that and think about what our next step was. And then, of course, you go back around the loop. So hopefully there's some useful tools in there. And of course, then you would go back and reconceptualize and see where you are at. But that kind of brings me to the end of my 10 minutes. So hopefully there's some things that caught people's interest.
Great, thank you, Dave. I'm just going to stop my share, and so we can go into a bit of time for some questions. If anybody has questions, what I'm first going to do is just address a couple that were in the chat during the session. But then I'm going to ask if people want to ask, to either raise your hand on the screen or virtually, and I'll take three questions or so at a time. And then either me, Louise or Dave can have a go at answering them. And you might have specific questions for each of us or more general questions, and that's okay. But before I do, I just want to go to a question which was posed by Emma in the chat around small versus large organisations and how this differs for them, and obviously very different resources, very different team makeups. So yeah, it will look different, this culture. And I suppose I'll ask if Louise or Dave have any thoughts. My initial thought would be that some things are the same. So some of the principles about kind of being really mission focused and holding that as the really important thing, and how you get there being a bit more adaptable to that, I think is applicable for any size organization. I think being willing to learn, to change, having the attitude of being curious are things that any size organization can have. I think probably where a small organization has to really think a bit more is this question of proportionality. So how can you do this in a proportionate way so you don't spend all your time collecting data, you won't have time to actually do anything. So that's really, really important and quite a difficult challenge for smaller organizations. And I think also this question around skills. So, you know, you might have a smaller team, and so thinking about you might not have, you know, a measurement and evaluation team or exactly the right skills on the team. So thinking, if you don't have that, how can you get that from externally, or do you have to do some capacity building? So they're the kind of two really important things I think for smaller organisations. Louise or Dave, I don't know if you have anything to, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you've covered it off quite well. I think the thing that I would add is to say, I think depending on how small you are, if you're a couple of people, it's a bit different. But if you're for some smaller charities, I think still looking at those different domains of culture can be helpful. It can just give you a way of tackling what feels like a really big problem.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add, I think, I mean, in terms of proportionality, it's also prioritizing what it is that you're wanting to measure and understand. So what are the questions you want to actually ask and answer? And I think there are some elements of being a small charity which actually means that you can be more flexible and adaptive and responsive as well, which I think has some real benefits. Before I worked for Diabetes UK, I actually worked for a local authority, which is much bigger than where I work now, and trying to change an organisation of that size is much more challenging, I think. So that's something to add.
I'm sure, thank you. And just one more question from Sylvia around collecting data for questions you want to answer for learning, and then versus collecting data that you have to collect for funders. And actually sometimes they feel like quite different activities, and sometimes they're not aligned. And I think this is a real challenge for lots of organisations. And I think particularly those who have lots of different funders, who have quite high funding requirements, it can feel like you spend all of your time just collecting data for that. And I think my initial response to that would be to try and align these as much as possible. So when talking to funders, when considering funding streams, have those learning questions in your mind, because actually what you know, in an ideal world, these things are aligned. So the data you're being asked to collect matches the questions that you want to learn, and what your funder wants to learn. And obviously in reality, there are often differences, but having a sort of stronger learning culture and a more curious culture, and having your learning questions really front of mind when embarking on new projects, even when fundraising, when talking to your funders, I think that can help to slowly align those two. And yes, Tim said funders should be just as keen to hear about failure and learning as successes. Exactly. So, you know, often we think that funders just want us to fill in that form, but actually often the really good relationships can develop with funders, and the real impact can come for funders when they're hearing about that learning. So yeah, definitely try and bring them in on the journey. Okay, so I'm going to give a chance for people to ask other questions that they have now. So please, yeah, raise your hand virtually or in real life, and I will try and pick those questions up. Oh, also, we've got a point from Megan saying, speaking as a funder, push back on your funders. Having honest conversations is really important, and funders can only change if they understand what isn't working. Good answer to that. Thank you, Megan. Any other questions from anyone else? Either for me or Louise or Dave. Emma, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Sorry, I know I've already asked the question.
That's all right.
I was just really interested in the last slide that Dave showed us, and what I might call, hopefully, it's a progression from chaotic and reactive to proactive and pervasive. That one, yes. And I was wondering if you had examples of practically how an organization has moved from one to the other. So I'm just moving from a large organization to a very small organization, and from a position of trying to influence change to hopefully driving a learning culture. But this is one of the challenges I've had in a large organization. It can feel very reactive. And I obviously I would like to leave some sort of learning behind me. And I was just curious, how have people made that work?
So, yeah. So I think sometimes it happens by accident, often, which is probably not. But having this framework in mind can actually, I think, can help to be less accidental about it, really. I think I think what's important is to have a focus. So, for example, when I was at Macmillan, we started a set of evaluation training, and I think we went from very chaotic to reactive. So maybe not from reactive to proactive at the time, but we had lots of different approaches to trying to get on top of, like, everybody needed to know a way of being able to do some evaluation. And lots of solutions were popping up in different parts of the organization. And I think what we tried to do was do a solid program of training around evaluation, to do some setting example by putting some real effort into some particular ones. And then that allowed us to move towards a more patchy implementation. And we focused on certain parts of the organization that wanted it. So I think that's an important thing too, is sometimes start where there is energy, because when you start where there is energy, some people think, oh, that's great, and they start talking about it positively. And you've got your champions without calling them champions and labeling them champions, and everybody getting champion fatigue. You've just got people who think it's the right way to go. And I think that's the most genuine champion you can have. So I think what we did was to try and chunk things up a bit and really focus where the energy was, and that moved us along, and then reflect back on where we were and see where we could get to next.
Great, thank you, Dave. I love that phrase, champion fatigue. I haven't heard that before. It's a really good one. Brilliant. And actually, Emma, you've sort of, this question's perfectly framed our breakout group task, actually. So that's quite a nice introduction to it, which I will move on to, unless anyone has any other questions that they wanted to ask before that. No, all right then. Well, we'll move on to our breakout groups, and you're going to be virtually zoomed into a much smaller group in a moment. What I would encourage you to do in your group is to use this sort of here on chaotic, reactive, proactive. In fact, I'm going to show you through here. And maybe think for a moment, just individually on your own, where do you think your organisation is currently along this spectrum? So, you know, you've got some kind of some pointers underneath here to sort of which describe that, and it might be there slightly in between phases, and that's all right. But just take a minute to think about where are you as an organisation. And then what I'd encourage you to do is share that with those in your group and talk through why you think your organisation is in that phase. And then secondly, what we have on this slide is a description of those knowledge, attitudes and behaviours that we talked about earlier that can encourage a more learning culture. And actually having a think about, if you could pick one or two of these, changing which of these do you think will enable your organisation to move along that learning journey? So, you know, what are the key things in your organizations? Is it sort of knowledge or attitudes or behaviors that will really help? And just discuss that amongst your group. And we don't have very much time back in plenary, so I'm going to encourage each group to just share one thing from the discussion that they'd like to share with the wider group. So perhaps agree on that before you're brought back into the plenary discussion as well. So you're going to be zoomed into breakout groups now, and I would ask that everyone comes back. Well, you'll automatically be pulled back into the group at 20 past 3. And yes, also the recording of this and the slides will be shared after the event as well, just so you all know. Okay, Rebecca, are we all ready to transfer people into groups? Thanks, everyone. See you very shortly. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we've got everyone back now. Welcome back. Hopefully you enjoyed the discussion in your breakout groups. And hopefully you all got to see the slides. I know there might have been a hiccup at that initially, but hopefully you got all those in front of you in the end, and you managed to share some thoughts in your group. So we had 4 breakout groups, and I just wanted to ask each of the breakout groups to share something that they either learned from each other or something they found particularly helpful or just came up in the discussion today. So, and I don't know if any of you managed to nominate people, but I wonder from breakout group 2, is there anybody who'd like to share kind of some important insights or lessons from the discussion they had in their groups?
Yeah, I'm happy to do a quick summary. I was moderating. So the first bit was about the importance of having senior buy-in in terms of the learning and development, and involving practitioners and people on the ground. And there was another really interesting discussion around the kind of types of people involved. If organisations had like lots of lawyers or people with a medical or science background, it could be a kind of overemphasis almost on the standards of evidence, and missing out on the kind of some of the softer data and stories. And finally, there's a really good point about learning happening at the end of a project. That's the kind of the thinking, rather than a more continuous process.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting point. Often comes up. I think often it's seen as an end of, done at the end, and actually it makes such a big difference just thinking about it from the beginning. It's a small kind of shift in mindset, but it can make a huge difference. Brilliant, thank you, Ben. Breakout group 3. Does anybody want to share kind of key insights from that?
Yeah, we didn't manage to nominate. So I'll take it on the mantle. I think we had some really interesting points, particularly around, similar to what Ben said about sort of involving frontline staff all the way through those sort of learnings. But the word used was empowerment. So that sense of empowering frontline staff to feedback where things aren't working, and sort of not feeling maybe overwhelmed or intimidated by the weight of tradition, by the weight of the way things have always been done. I thought that was a really interesting observation. And also accepting failure without blame was another really interesting point that I heard.
Great, thank you, Olivia. And yeah, that failure without blame is such an easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to actually do. So I think quite, something we discussed in the sort of first part of today, and different things that you can do. But yeah, and I know it's a journey with that one. I think it doesn't take, it takes time to kind of get that going, but it can be such a powerful thing when you do. Breakout group 4. Does anybody want to share some of the discussion there? Dave, I think this might be.
That was our group, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you decided to nominate anybody.
I don't think we managed to get to that point. So I'll sum up as best I can. I think probably my fault. We spent a bit too long reflecting on the first of the 2 slides. But I think that a couple of the key points were that actually the perspectives on where you might be against either the knowledge, attitudes, behaviours, or the whether you're chaotic or pervasive, the perspective from different people within the organization might be quite different. And that's a challenge to navigate. Claire suggested maybe the team using the sort of knowledge, attitudes, behaviors sort of framework, using that with a team of people and getting different people to score it and reflect on it together might be something useful and generate discussion. So I think there was a general sense that the frameworks were kind of helpful, but that even within very small organizations, the perspectives can differ wildly, and that's true for bigger organizations too. And the movement or the transition to go from this is where we're at to this is how we're going to start to measure things and reflect on them is a really challenging transition to make. And moving from where you've done your theory of change and there's lots of qual stuff to thinking about quant stuff and it'll turn them into, you know, measurable things is a really challenging exercise and challenging time. I think that's a brief summary of our group, but please do others from our group say.
Thank you, Dave. No, that's really, really interesting and helpful. Thank you. And Breakout Group 1 was my group. And before we just got zoomed back in, Ian was sharing something with the group. I just want to give you the chance to finish, or if not, I'm happy to share my reflection.
Well, we all said we were sort of spread out at different points along the framework. So perhaps a sort of positive take from that would be that it is actually possible to fast track towards the right, at least certain elements of the right-hand side. If you're a small charity or if you've got a senior person who's willing to back you, that seems to be a common theme, then you don't have to tick off every element of reactive before you move to proactive, for example.
Yeah, I think that was really important. And actually kind of building on Dave and Ian's points, something I took from the discussion was just that you're not, it's hard to pinpoint one point along that journey, and actually whether it's the different elements of the journey are at different stages, or as Dave said, the people have different perspectives of where you are on that journey, or it's in slightly relative terms. That's actually, you know, it's okay to have multiple points along the spectrum. I guess the idea is always that you're looking for a shift towards the right, you know, in general. So I think that was a really interesting thing that came out of it. Well, thank you all so much for sharing those insights, and hopefully you found it helpful to kind of to talk a bit more about your organisation in the groups. We'll be sharing the slides from this session and the notes, so all the links to the resources that I mentioned will be on there. And NPC's got lots and lots of resources on impact management and developing a learning culture. So please do take a look at our website and Inspiring Impact website for more. Again, we'll share these with the slides. And you know, if you do want to discuss any of this further, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me or any of my colleagues. Our details are on the website. And before we close, I'd just like to thank Dave and Louise again for sharing their experience with us and sharing their time. And so just to all of you for giving up an hour and a half of your afternoon. Hopefully you found it really helpful. And also thank you for sharing your questions and your thoughts and your experience as well. We are going to be, in the name of feedback and learning, we are going to be sharing a feedback form after this webinar. So please do just take a minute or two to fill that in. It's how we learn, the impact that we're having and how we improve. So yeah, please do take a minute to feed that in if you can. And yes, I think that's all from us. Thank you again for your time. And I hope you all have a nice afternoon.